Annual Anthony Aveni Lecture in Native American Studies. The Anthony Aveni Lecture Series is sponsored by the Native American Studies program, and the lecture today is also co-sponsored by the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. First, I would like to thank Carolyn Lorenz and Amanda Stewart for all their hard work in setting up this event. I'd also like to thank Robert Valadez for giving us his permission to use his artwork in the advertising for this event. And I'd also like to acknowledge with respect the Oneida Indian Nation on whose ancestral lands Colgate University is located. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce our inaugural Anthony Aveni Lecture Series speaker. Dr. David Carrasco is the Neil L. Rudenstein Professor of the Study of Latin America at Harvard University, with a joint appointment at the Harvard Divinity School and the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University. His research is world-renowned and focuses on the history of religions, the role of religion in the rise of the first cities in the Americas, as well as cultures and religious exchanges in the Mexican-American borderlands. Dr. Carrasco is the author of numerous books and articles, and he's the author and editor of over 15 books, including The Religions of Mesoamerica, the award-winning Quetzalcoatl and the Irony of Empire, Myths and Prophecies in the Aztec Tradition, which also won the Chancellor's Book Award from the University of Colorado, City of Sacrifice, the Aztec Empire and the Role of Violence in Civilizations, and the celebrated Cave City and Eagle's Nest, which received the gold medal from Publishers of the West, and along with numerous other volumes, which there's too many to list right now. He's received the Mexican Order of the Aztec Eagle, which is the highest honor the Mexican government gives to a foreign national, for his contributions to understanding the history of cultures of Mexico. Dr. Carrasco is a celebrated and highly coveted public speaker, so I'd like to thank him so much for joining us today and for persisting through the weather and the plane cancellations, which made your trip here very difficult. Dr. Carrasco's talk today is entitled Aztec Imaginaries, From the Codex Mendoza to Chicano Art. It's my great honor to introduce Dr. David Carrasco.
Okay, so I want to thank Colgate University for this signal opportunity to, an honor to presenting the inaugural Anthony Aveni Lecture in Native American Studies. I'm just curious, how many people here, how many students here have had a chance to take a course with Professor Aveni, who I know is not teaching right now? How many of you have had a chance? Okay, so only a few of you, and so it's really important that you're here, and it's important that I do my best to communicate to you the significance of this teacher, this scholar, this human being for not only me, but for Colgate University and also for several other scholarly disciplines around the world. Because what you have here in Anthony Aveni at Colgate University, has been here, I think, many, many years, is somebody who is not only a kind of a college treasure, but you have someone who is an innovator, a true innovator in scholarship, and also someone who dedicated his life to students, to student well-being. And that's one of the things I think not only makes him so special, but it makes Colgate special, because he's been here with you at your school. He's been a mentor, a colleague, and a friend of mine for many years, and his wife, the beloved Lorraine Aveni, has also enriched our friendship and my own life with her photographic art and hospitality. So it's wonderful to be here with them. Please give them both a round of applause. We'll have a chance to hear a little bit more from Tony, because we're going to have a little conversation with him at the end of my presentation, because I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to hear him, interact with him, and see his mind work for yourselves. During my talk, I'm going to raise a few questions for Tony Aveni about the evolution of his own thought on Native American cultures and cosmology. I'll specifically be reflecting on the three modes of human orientation that I see at work in Mesoamerican materials and in Tony's work. So I'm going to be taking this notion of culture and religion as a form of orientation. There you go. As a form of orientation. And asking Tony to talk about how his own experience as an archaeoastronomer, as an anthropologist, has evolved over the years as he's encountered not only sacred places, different types of astronomies, different types of primary texts, but especially in relationship to this notion of Aztec Imaginaries. Now, I like this photograph of Tony Aveni to start with, not only because he's wearing my hat, but I want you to take a look at the photograph for a minute. I see a man who is contemplating, who's thinking carefully, and he's looking off in a certain direction. And I want to raise the whole notion of that direction, because one of the things that's been important in his work is this whole question of directionality, or alignments. Directionality and alignments are very important for him, very important for astronomers, for archaeoastronomers, and that's one of the modes of human orientation I want to talk about and have him talk about with us. What Jonathan Smith calls the locative view of the world, where things are aligned, where things are in order. But that's not the only Tony Aveni that we've known over the years. Here's another Tony Aveni. I like this because it's kind of the opposite view of Tony Aveni. I think he's here trying to look like Tlaloc, the rain god. This is one of the Mesoamerican Archive meetings. That's Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, the great Mexican archaeologist in the background, looking amused as his colleague has suddenly raised this mask up for that moment when the photographer was trying to catch him off guard. But here, you see, you have something where the social emphasis is being out of place. Somebody on the border between seriousness and silliness, what Victor Turner called the liminal view of the world, where change of direction, and tricksters dwell. Let me say that I also am glad to see my former student, Phil Arnold, here with his wife, Sandy Bigtree. Phil is a former student of mine, became a colleague. He's at Syracuse University. And one of the reasons that I also want to thank Phil is that my relationship with Tony Aveni began really in the 1983, 84, in the early 80s. He had already become a rising star in archaeoastronomy. I was a young professor trying to find my way at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And I immediately saw that his own study of archaeoastronomy was going to teach me a lot about my own study of religion and cosmology. And so I invited him to come to the University of Colorado for 6 weeks. He and Lorraine came there, and during that time, we set up a series of seminars, which I called Conversations with Anthony Aveni, History of Religions and Archaeoastronomy. And we did a little publication, and the publication was a publication of a series of 3 really interviews that I did with Tony Aveni. We had it on the campus. Other professors and students came. It became a kind of a big deal. And we published this little pamphlet called Conversations with Anthony Aveni. And over the years, it's been one of the bestsellers. This small pamphlet where Tony Aveni was holding forth as an archaeoastronomer in dialogue with anthropologists and historians of religions. And I just happened to find the original mock-up of it this week, published in 1984. And I was looking through it, and there's Phil Arnold who really was the editor. I think I tested Phil. I don't know how to do this. You do it. Phil did it. And in the original, I got notes to Phil on the back. Phil, do this. Phil, please take care of this. So it's great to have Phil here. This is the original. Someday it's going to be, Colgate librarians should come after me and say, we want this in our archive. Because this is a very special piece of scholarship that reflects, in a sense, the kind of humanity of Anthony Aveni, even as he was a scholar, helping out a younger colleague find his way. So I feel like I'm here a little bit with my intellectual family. And I'm glad to be able to share with you some of my work as an historian of religions, and my talk is going to be in 5 parts. I wanted to share with you a few images of Anthony Aveni and his work. I'm going to talk about these 3 Aztec imaginaries, 3 Aztec ways of way in which Aztecs were represented in relationship to spatial orientation. One called the locative view of the Aztec world, another one which I call the Crossroads View of the Aztec world, and finally what I'll call a transcultural, transhistorical view of the Aztec world. And that is really the way in which contemporary Mexican Americans, Latinos, who feel that they've been left out of the American story by the people who have written the American story, make moves to find their own story in this time and place by acknowledging, as Kristen did when she introduced me, that Native American presence and Native American peoples and Native American cultures are part of our heritage. And so what many Latinos and Chicanos have done in trying to find identity and practice certain political ways of being in the United States is they have leaned back into the Aztec and Maya world and said these symbols and these stories have something to do with us. Not only because we have heritage going back to that territory and going back to that DNA, but partly because we have been left out, forced out, kept out of the North American story. And so the final trans-historical, transcultural view is going to, in a sense, bring us into that sort of Chicano art and the way in which it tries to tell the story a different way. So, images of Anthony Aveni and his work. So one of the things I wanted to do for the students here was to let you know what an extraordinary writer Tony Aveni was. And so I decided I'd put together one PowerPoint slide of his books. Okay? But the PowerPoint fought back and said, you can't have all of his books on one PowerPoint slide because you got too many books. And I want to show you what happened to my PowerPoint attempt to put Tony Aveni's books on one PowerPoint slide. So he starts out with this book called Skywatchers, and here you see the Skywatchers of Ancient Mexico. The original version was called, and here you see this book with this image of the Caracol at Chichen Itza. But then later on he has another book called the Madrid Codex, because he's not just looking at archaeology, he's also looking at the pictorial manuscripts. This one bounces in, it's called The Measure and Meaning of Time in Mesoamerica and the Andes. He wasn't satisfied with Aztec and Maya. He had to go to Peru in the Andes. And he went down there and did some marvelous work. And then what you have is him reaching out to the public and working to write not just for scholars, but for the general public, so that the kind of knowledge that he is gaining, not only in terms of his research, but in terms of his interaction with other scholars, can be shared with the public to educate them about the sky and the earth, our astronomy, archaeoastronomy. And then later on he publishes this book, which is some of the best essays of his and by other people, called Foundations of New World Astronomy, a reader with commentary by Anthony Aveni. So that's a very important word for the students here to understand, because Aveni was not only at the foundation of archaeoastronomy, which is a discipline that he was the sole or one of the very few originators of a new type of scholarship, but his work has become foundational for the rest of us. Absolutely fundamental. This week, I told William Taylor, the great Latin American historian, I was coming here, and he said, oh, Anthony Aveni, he said, this guy has made a contribution that's really essential to all of us who want to study Latin America. And that's really important to hear from somebody outside of his field. You go a little further, Anthony Aveni, Empires of Time, Calendars, Clocks, and Cultures, revised edition. Now, many of us as scholars, we would have been fine with one or two of these books. But here goes Aveni, he can't stop. Here's the Book of the Year, a brief history of our seasonal holidays, Now here they come. See, my PowerPoint said I can't just do one. In the Shadow of the Moon, the Science, Magic, and the Mystery of Social Eclipses, People in the Sky. I was honored that he dedicated this book to me. Two more had to pop up. I tried to just get one at a time. Between the Lines. Here he is back in Peru with the Nazca Lines. Another one for the public, Behind the Crystal Ball. Magic, Science, and the Occult. Then four of them came up. I couldn't stop them. And Apocalyptic Anxiety, Anthony Aveni, Buried Beneath Us, The First Americans, a children's book that won an award, and then, of course, Class Not Dismissed, something having to do with the way in which, he really wanted to summarize his own reflections on undergraduate education. You get that? Undergraduate education. So important to him here. And I really like this one, Circling the Square, How the Conquest altered the shape of time in Mesoamerica. There are many others, but I just wanted to give the students in here a sense of the kind of writer, scholar, public intellectual Colgate has had all of this time. And one of the reasons I think it's so important to have this lecture series, certainly on Native America, but his work was not just in Native America. One of the things that he's done that's also difficult to do, he's compared not only Native American traditions within themselves, but Native American traditions with the Mediterranean traditions, with Asian traditions. And so what you have here is a very special, very unusual, very brilliant kind of contribution. Now, Professor Aveni helped me create a community of scholars who you see here, and these are some of the leading scholars in the world in the Mesoamerican studies. Again, when we were starting to work there in Colorado years ago, when we did conversations with Anthony Aveni, he said, look, man, he said, we were talking one day and I said, I go to these big meetings, American Academy of Religion, and 3,000, 5,000 people are there. And you're running down the hall, you go to this room, and people are there, and you shake hands, and you sit down, and you stand up, and you give a 15-minute talk, and then somebody does, and you say goodbye, and then you leave. And you've spent months and months. And we said, why don't we create an alternative kind of intellectual space where we don't have to do these 15-minute, 20-minute talks. We can go spend time together. So he and I created with Eduardo Matos the Mesoamerican Archive at the University of Colorado in Boulder. We created this in 1984, and it's still working today. And we created a community of people who came together sometimes for an entire week. And when you came and gave a paper, you didn't come and give the paper for 10 or 15 minutes. You had a whole morning for your paper. You gave the paper, somebody would respond, and there'd be a discussion. Then in the afternoon, somebody else would give a paper, and there'd be a response, and then there was a discussion. And we felt this was the way to really do what was important to Tony, which is this idea of, of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary studies, not as a concept, but as a practice. And we were able to do this. Let me just show you some of the people who were part of our thing. Here's Eduardo Matos, the great Mexican archaeologist. Here's Charles Long, a historian of religion. Henry Nicholson, probably the finest reader of the primary sources in Mexico, ever. Here's Ed Kalnick. Here's Vince Stanzioni. He's been living up in the Maya area for 30 years. He's a student of ours. He speaks 3 Mayan languages. Robert Bai, one of the great ethnobotanists of Mexico. Lindsay Jones. Here's John Hogue. Down here is Dr. Loco, Jose Cuellar. There's Phil Arnold. right there. And there's Tony Aveni. Check him out. Now check that face out. Check out, there's a look on that face. You see? And one of the things that I noticed about this picture, in terms of alignments, is he's the only one standing underneath the clock. See? He's the only one underneath the clock. I mean, it was just amazing to me. How could it be that this photographer, without realizing it, takes this? Now, take a look at his face. See? There's something devilish about that face. Because a few minutes later, we took another photograph where we put on these 3D glasses. This guy was showing us 3D photography. See, here it is. Here we are. And there's Tony. You see, there's Tony pulling his fast one, putting up the mask. I got a close-up of him here, see? Right underneath the clock. This is the kind of guy Tony Aveni has been to us. With this community that we created, and out of this community has probably come 60 or 70 books that have been published about the Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, archaeoastronomy, history of religions. And this also shows you we had a good time. We had a really good time. And Tony Aveni was one of the main reasons that we had a good time. Just one other photo here of our colleagues. Here's Ed Kalnick on the left, a really dear friend of him we haven't seen for a while. And then Charles Long, the African-American scholar that we've been working with. And this kind of shows you the kind of intellectual life we had together that has been going on here at Colgate all this time. So I want to talk about these three Aztec Imaginaries in the light of this wonderful collegial relationship that I have with Tony. And so for a number of years, my work has been studying the cosmological orientation, having to do with the symbolic order and religious ritual of a series of Mesoamerican capitals, including the Mexica capital of Tenochtitlan, which I'm going to return to, and also the pilgrimage city of Cholula. Now I want you to take a look at these two images because they reflect what I'm trying to present here for the students, for you to think about two different ways of orienting yourselves in your lives. See, the one on the left has these causeways that clearly go into the center. Everything seems aligned in some way. Everything is organized. Straight lines, squares, things are in order. Now over here, you see something quite different. You see a church that's located on top of, which is actually a pyramid that has been grown over, one of the largest pyramids in the world at Cholula. But you get a sense of a lot of movement here. You not only get a sense of the church colonialism on top of, buried beneath it, this great, but you get this idea of movement. Here's a ceremonial pilgrimage pathway. It's not a straight line. It's a curved line. It goes up the hill. So you get a different sense of spatial orientation in this city. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how this city was the city that you went to, and this is the city that you went through. A very different kind of city and a very different kind of experience in space. Now, while I was studying these things at the University of Chicago, I was also involved in the Chicano movement. This was a civil rights movement, a movement among Mexican Americans here in this country. And I saw how in the barrios of the Mexican Americans, there was an awful lot of artwork, a different type of imaginary, but it was also associated with the Aztec world. And here you see just a mural in one of the communities. It's a local version of the Aztec calendar stone with an image of the Aztec sun god. You also have these incredible tattoos where Mexican Americans felt that as part of this identity struggle in a society that was saying, just what they're saying now. The president likes to go around doing this a lot. But to the Latinos and the Mexicans, he's going like this a lot. See, and so people who do that a lot, what you're going to say is, you know what, man, we're going to put something else on our skin. And so what they began to put on their skins were these marvelous images of the Aztecs, another type of imaginary. So what I'm going to talk about is three types of Aztec imaginaries. The way in which people look at Aztec materials and imagine themselves in relationship to these materials. This is the first one, where you see an image from the Codex Mendoza, which I'm going to show you some close-ups of in a minute, and where things all seem to be in order, in line. Everything seems to fit into a certain type of location. I also want to talk about this image, where you see the opposite, where everything seems to be moving. It's kind of confusing. It's a lot more like a labyrinth. It seems to be going in different directions. Nothing seems to be clear. And thirdly, I'm going to be talking about this painting. This painting has just been produced. It's going to be unveiled at Harvard on Wednesday afternoon at the Harvard Divinity School, which has purchased this painting. It's 5 feet tall and 4 feet wide. It's by the Mexican-American artist George Yepes. It's called the Guerrero Aguila. So it's a Mexican-American painter who is painting an Aztec image along with the Mexican flag, but all in honor of a contemporary human being. This is Eduardo Matos, who you saw earlier, Matos Moctezuma. And this represents the way in which people who are in a contemporary struggle for identity and citizenship are trying to say, we have to develop a transhistorical, a transcultural view of ourselves. Not one that just fits in order, not one that's just about traveling through liminal spaces, but one that has layers to it, historical layers. A contemporary layer to the colonial layer to the pre-Columbian layer. Because if we stop at just the contemporary layer, we're denying our ancestors. If we just stop at the colonial layer, we're acknowledging our own subjugation. But if we go to the pre-Columbian layer as well, we're saying we're all of these things in some way, and that the future has to somehow reflect this past. So these are the three orientations I want to talk about. So on one hand, we call this a locative map of the world. That is a world where things fit into place, things are all in line, or what I call a crossroads map of the world, where you really understand yourself not to be stable and in place, but you understand yourself to be at a crossroads. And being at a crossroads may seem like confusion to students. You may not like the ambiguity, but what it means in this kind of artistic style is that you're at a moment of great potential. You're at a moment of things that are unfulfilled, but there's potentiality there. And it seems to me that the crossroads view of the world really emphasizes that. And these cities involved, there's the great temple of Tenochtitlan associated with that map. Here's that particular image of the cathedral that's located on this particular map. Here's the painting, and this represents this transhistorical map of the world. So students, 3 maps of the world. A locative map of the world, a crossroads map of the world, and a transhistorical map of the world. All the kinds of maps that Tony Aveni himself has studied and reflected upon. Now, some of you have heard this story before, but most of you haven't. I was kind of prepared for this type of study in part through my grandmother and grandfather. This is my grandmother, Carlota Carranza Carrasco. She was born in the Copper Canyon. She was part Tarahumara. Here you see her and with my grandfather. And when we were kids, we were always impressed with her skin, how beautiful her dark skin was, and how she was able, well into her 70s, to have this beautiful skin. And so one day we asked her, this Mexican grandmother, how is it that your skin is so wonderful? And she said, well, I have a secret ingredient. And we said, well, what's the secret ingredient? And she said, well, if you lean in, I'll whisper it to you. And we said, okay, what is it? She says, my secret ingredient for this skin is prayer, 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 and good cosmetics. And this was a kind of important message to me as a kid. I was only 10 years old at the time, because what it taught me was to think both in terms of the celestial and the terrestrial. It had me to think about having relationship with some other outside of my control, but also to take seriously the technology of the face. The whole question of working on your appearance, of presenting yourself both as who you were and as a mask. And that combination is something that I think served me very well over the years. The other thing that happened to me is what I call my Aztec moment. So when I was 13 years old, I went to live in Mexico City with my father, who was invited by the Confederación Deportiva Mexicana to go and help train Mexican coaches for the Olympic Games. While I was there, my Aunt Milena took me to the museum. At that time, the museum was right down this street, right down behind this presidential palace. So here's one of these great spaces where everything seems to be in order. Here's the presidential palace, here's the National Cathedral, and at that time, the museum was right behind this palace. And I went there as a 13-year-old. It was my first trip to Mexico City. I'd been to the border a number of times, but it was my first trip to Mexico City. And it was unbelievable to be in Mexico City, because I'd heard all kinds of negative stuff about Mexico City and Mexico. Even though in my family there was pride and some identity with it. And while I was there, I went to this museum, and I saw all these incredible things in the museum. I saw Maya jades, and I saw pictorial manuscripts, and I saw the great calendar stone. And I began to realize there was not only sophistication, there was brilliance, there was genius, there was complexity there that I had no idea about. I hadn't been prepared for this in my school, and I began to have a very paradoxical feeling inside of myself at the time, because I began to feel, on the one hand, that, hey man, I had been taught in the schools to be ashamed of my Latino identity and my Mexican background. I've been taught that this was, from the halls of Moctezuma to the shores of Tripoli, that whole marine fight song. This is what Americans were always beating up on these people. Westerners were always victorious over these people, whether they were Tony's people, those Italians, or Mexicans. This was the part of the deal. And I realized, as I saw these things, that I had internalized a lot of this negative stuff about my tradition, my family, that side of who my family was. But at the same time that I became aware that day that I had internalized some of this shame, I also began to feel a pride and potential in coming to know about this world. And so I remember going out into the Zocalo and walking around as a 13-year-old and feeling something very big changing in my awareness. On the one hand, realizing that I had the shame, on the other hand, that there was this reason for pride, reason for further study. And I realized, I grew up in Washington, D.C. My father was the first Mexican-American to be a head basketball coach of a university, and he was the first coach in Washington, D.C. to bring black players onto this court with white players. Here was a brown coach with black and white people playing for the first time in the history of Washington, D.C. in public sports. And I realized, I'm not black and I'm not white. I'm a mestizo. I'm somehow a mixture of these things. And this seemed to me to be not so much a source of shame or pride, but of potential, something that I could come to know and appreciate about myself. And I began to realize that Mexico City, as I was seeing it, really had beneath it this other world. And there were this layering of these worlds. And that somehow it was going to be very important for me in my life to move forward and try to understand both of these histories. Not only the contemporary history, but the colonial history, which you see at the top, and the pre-Columbian history below. And so it was with this kind of background that led me, in a sense, to be able to find a mentor and a friend in Tony Aveni and carry my work forward. And at that time, I was at the University of Colorado. I went to the University of Colorado. I was very much influenced by this professor named Paul Wheatley. And one of the things that he taught me when I went to the University of Chicago, which is very important for students here to know, is that I found out that Mesoamerica, Mexico, Central America, was one of the 7 areas in human history where people invented the first cities. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, what am I leaving out? Peru. These were China. These were places where people had learned how to cooperate and to compete in such a way that they were the ones who invented the first complex urban societies. That is, Native Americans built cities. Native Americans built cities, and that was amazing to me. And Wheatley taught us that the city itself was such important as a style center, as a central place that organized so much that was beyond the city. And to realize that Mexico was one of these places led me then to be able to go ahead and study this area, building on my Aztec moment. And so now I want to move into these 3 images of the world that you find represented in these Aztec imaginaries. So what you have here is the frontispiece of the Codex Mendoza. And I'm going to take you through a series of images from inside of this codex that comes from 1542. And I'm very impressed, and I'll be very interested in seeing how Tony thinks about this, by the amount of order that's on this image. Now, one of the scholars who I used to help me think about this is a man named Jonathan Z. Smith. And Jonathan Z. Smith wrote a book called Map is Not Territory. And in Map is Not Territory, he writes this: I would term this cosmology a locative map of the world, and the organizer of such a world an imperial figure. It is a map of the world which guarantees meaning and value through structures of congruity and conformity. And one of the things that Jonathan Smith said was in a lot of these ancient civilizations, this is what they were striving for. They were striving for a locative view of the world where people lock things into place, but there always had to be an imperial figure. And this imperial figure is really crucial in this. And of course we know that when the Spaniards came into the Valley of Mexico in 1519, they were totally impressed with the locative view of the world. One of the conquistadors named Bernal Diaz del Castillo gives us this description of how things were organized and were very straight. He says, during the morning, we arrived at a broad causeway and continued our march toward Iztapalapa. And when we saw so many cities built in the water and other great towns on dry land, and then here's that locative line, that straight and level causeway going towards Mexico, we were amazed and said it was like the enchantments they tell of in the legend of Amadis, on account of the great towers and quays and buildings rising from the water and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things we saw were not a dream. It is not to be wondered at that I write it down in this manner, for there's so much to think over. I do not know how to describe it, seeing things as we did that had never been heard of or seen before or even dreamed about. And so one of the things that they saw was this ordered world. Now, the Codex Mendoza, this is very important for this and the second part of the lecture, the next part of the lecture. This is a document that is painted in 1542, 20 years after the arrival of the Spaniards. And it's painted in three sections. One section is a history of the conquest of the Aztec kings. So it's about imperial figures. And every page on it, that section has an imperial figure. And here's the imperial figure. Here are the years of the imperial figure's reign. And here are the towns that that imperial figure has conquered. Notice how everything is in a line. Everything is nicely lined up here because everything's in order. So this is a painting, this is a document that's painted in 1542 for another imperial figure. It's painted for the King of Spain. So you have two levels of imperial figures who are influencing the way in which this is painted. The second section of the Codex Mendoza that is painted for the King of Spain is all about the tribute payments that are paid to the capital by the 400 cities and towns which are part of the Aztec Empire. And here you see the second section of the Codex Mendoza. The third section of the Codex Mendoza, painted for the King of Spain so he can see what his new empire includes, is the daily life of an Aztec from birth to death. And here you see actually a wedding scene that I'm going to come back to in a moment. So here you have in the 1540s this Aztec imagery being created, painted by Aztec painters who are now also picking up some European artistic styles for the King of Spain. And what impresses me so much about this is how much things are very much in line. So take a look at some of the fit this locative view of the world. So take a look again at the frontispiece. The frontispiece, and here's one of the reasons I wanted to have a conversation with Tony Aveni for the students here. Where do you put your eyes when you take a look at this? Do you look first of all at the centerpiece of it? The central image, that's where many of your eyes are drawn to? That's where mine were, because that's... Or do you look at the periphery? When you look at this, do you think there's any astronomy in it? Where does Tony Aveni put his eyes? I want to ask him where he puts his eyes. So what you have here is the island of the city itself. The city was built on an island. It was built in 4 sections. These are waterways that go through the city. These men represent the leaders of the new city. When it was founded, the image of the eagle, which is also the sun god, landing on a blooming cactus, growing from a stylized heart, which is a stone in the middle. You have a skull rack here, other things. But over here you have the years, of 51 years of a 52-year cycle. And this is a very boxy world. I mean, this calendar is very boxy. One box after another, a repeating series of symbols. Everything seems to me to be very much in order. It's very interesting that there's one of these years that has a special symbol on it. And this is the symbol of a new fire ceremony. Takes place once every 52 years. This is just the front page of this. And I'm impressed with this locative nature of it. Here is the close-up of the central piece, noticing that everything itself is located in a kind of orderly fashion. Here's an imperial figure. Here is the ruler. Here's the ruler closest to the center, sitting on this throne. He's got his speech glyph here. And this represents, it seems to me, this kind of fascination with order, with precision, that you see in many pre-Columbian codices. Here's another one. Look, everything's in place. Everything's in location. One thing after another. Every dot, everything fits. You're going to say, well, that seems very normal. But you're going to see in the second image I show you, it's completely abnormal. So look at the conquests are on the locative imagery. In every page of the conquest, you have a line of conquest, a line of conquest, a line of conquest. Everything seems to me to fit very much with this locative imagery. The tribute payments, over here are the towns. Again, line after line of things. I see very little dynamism in this. It seems to me to be the Spaniards talking to the Aztecs and then all kind of agreeing that this is the way life was. Over here you have old elderly people also being managed to act in certain ways. Elderly people were allowed to booze it up. Here's a grandmother, she's boozing it up, that's okay. But there's people taking care of her. She's not wandering in the streets. Over here you have a wedding ceremony. Again, everybody's in a proper position. It's very interesting. Here's the couple tying the knot. It's kind of nice, huh? Tying the knot. Here's the father. Here's the mother. It's interesting, it's the mother who's giving the instructions here. You notice she's the one who's telling the couple, you better do this in terms of how you act. Let me go back one. Even there's a great emphasis in this book on how you discipline people. You keep them acting in a certain way, and that seems to me to be really quite important. And so one of the things that Aveni talks about in conversations with Aveni, he talks about how much precision he saw at that stage of his life in archaeoastronomy in these cultures. And I guess one of the questions I'm going to have for him is, now that he's had years to think about it, were there any societies that didn't have the kind of precision when he looked at their calendars, when he looked at the way in which they organized themselves? Is his early impression of great precision still hold up after all these years? Children who are disciplined, you have to watch out. I don't know how students here act or what they do on this campus to discipline people. But in this culture, what they would do is they would hold you over a fire with chilies. You'd have to breathe in all these chilies. And if you really acted out, well, they gave you some sharp stuff to take. So I don't think the deans will follow up here on this, but you never know. These are images of people who've committed crimes and have died. Again, you see this tremendous sense of imagery. Here's somebody who was stoned to death for breaking certain laws. But everything seems to me to be in tremendous one. In the 5-part government, again, things fit together. Things must fit together. This is a very powerful image in Chinese culture. Take a look at this. This is the second imagery. This is what I call the Crossroads View of the world. This is completely different in terms of its This is also a Mesoamerican painting, painted in the same year as the Codex Mendoza, but not for an imperial view. This is painted by the people who were inside of the empire. This is painted by people in Cuauhtinchan, which is on the other side of the mountains from Mexico City. There's a story about this. I was at Harvard, second or third year I was at Harvard, and the director of the David Rockefeller Center came to me one day and said, "Hey, have you ever heard of this document called the Mapa de Cuauhtinchan?" And I said, "Yeah, I heard about it because I know it disappeared years ago from a museum." And he said, "Well, guess what? One of the donors, who's a friend of David Rockefeller, came to me the other day and says she owns it." And I said, "Well, that's amazing. How could she own it? It's a Mexican national treasure." He said, "Well, she's so rich, she can own it." And they want to know if anybody here can read the hieroglyphs. And I said, "Well, let me take a look at it. I think I can." I flew to Mexico City. I went to this the home of this very wealthy family. I got in through several levels of security. And the owner of the mapa, she brought it out and put it on her dining room table for me. And this is what I saw. This is actually a digital reconstruction of this mapa, which is 3.5 feet wide and 6.5 feet, painted by indigenous painters in 1542, kept in the community up until the 1960s, where it went into a local museum and then it disappeared. It traveled in Mexico among some very wealthy people, and she purchased it so she could restore it. And she asked me to put together a study, Professor Aveni and 14 others, and we studied it for 5 years, and we produced a book. But I want you to see that this is a very different view of space. Now, this mapa tells a story. It also has a city in the center. Here's the city of Cholula, which was a rival of the Aztecs. But the story really starts over here in this place of 7 caves. Right? And I'm going to take you on this journey. But before I take you on this journey, I want you to see this very different type of description that may reflect how some of you are feeling as students here, where you don't feel everything's in order. That's what Victor Turner called a liminal view of the world. He says, the attributes of liminality, or of liminal persona, threshold people, I think of students as threshold people, elude or slip through the networks of classifications, are neither here nor there. They're in betwixt and in between the positions assigned and arrayed by law, custom, convention, and ceremonial. They're expressed by a rich variety of symbols in the many societies that ritualize social and cultural transitions. Liminality is frequently likened to death, to being in the womb, to invisibility, to darkness, to bisexuality, to the wilderness, and to an eclipse of the sun or moon. There's Tony Aveni's stuff, the ritual process. So we go back and take a look at this mapa, and I want to take you on a quick journey through it and see what you think, and ask Tony what he thinks. So here's the city in the middle, but the story is not told from the perspective of the people in the city. It's told from the perspective of the people over here. It's the people in this community who created this mapa. So unlike the Codex Mendoza, it's not an insider's view of themselves. It's an outsider's view of how they got to form this community in relationship to this city. So there's a dynamic relationship between the city and this community that painted this mapa. Right? Oh, this slips. Okay, here's the left side. Here's the left side of this map. This mapa is divided into 2 sides, at least in its design. Take a look at the left side of this mapa. The left side of this mapa starts up here in this place of 7 caves, which is shaped like a womb. There's a journey, a winding journey back and forth. I'll take you through it in a second. And they finally come to the city after this left side. But the right side of this mapa is completely different. The road goes all around in a great circumambulation of a huge territory, a big part of Mexico, and finally ends in their own community. So what do you make of the fact that they would narrate their great story, and on one side it looks like a labyrinth, on the other side it looks like a great circle. But show me something that's in order, that's in place here. So it begins here in this cave, place of 7 caves, thinking of the liminality, the threshold story, this crossroads story that I'm talking about. Here's a digital reconstruction. So here's the 7 caves. It's a hill. You're looking into the hill. There's the 7 caves where these ancestors are coming out of the caves. 7 groups coming out of this womb. Now down here, 2 priests have arrived from a journey from the city. Here are the 2 priests. You notice they're dressed differently, so there's not conformity, there's not uniformity. And they're talking to the people here, but they don't talk the same language, so you have the need for a bilingual person. Here's the bilingual translator. He's translating the message that's come from the city to these people, these warriors, and the message is, please come to the city and help us defend the city in a war. And these guys are tough guys. They're tough guys. But look who they're led by. They're led by a very powerful female. And this powerful female is named Obsidian Butterfly. Obsidian Butterfly. And here she is. But she's already had trouble, but she's overcome the trouble. We know she's had trouble because she's got all these arrows sticking in her. She's had these arrows sticking in her. But she's been victorious because she's got the leg trophy of a male deity who she's defeated. You know? This is the Me Too movement of the pre-Columbian period. Right here, you see it. This is what happens. This is what happens if you, you know. So, now here, just to show you what scientists can do. Here's the mappa before conservation. Here are those 2 individuals who've come from the city. After conservation, this is what the team was able to show. What you have here are these 2 individuals dressed up like city boys. They got fancy clothes on, and they got their names. Here's a feather lip. Here's a feather coming out of his mouth. His name is Feather Lip, and this is Serpent Foot, which is interesting because combination, it's a Quetzalcoatl. It's the feathered serpent here. The local people, they don't like them. They're throwing these rattlesnakes at him. See, the rattlesnakes are coming at him. They don't like these city boys who've come. But here's the bilingual translator. So bilingualism is right there. He's doing the translating. And they come out of the caves and they go on a journey, and you see all these little footprints in this liminal kind of process. Here you see eagle hunters, very important, eagle hunters. They come to this series of things, which I love this sequence. I call it crossing cosmic barriers. Here's a storm where the wind god has come along and taken this person and stripped them of their culture, of their clothes and their weapons. They go a little further. There seems to be kind of an earthquake, and these 2 individuals it looks like they're being taken in. Some people have thought these are the twins, the Maya twins. There's a flood, another one of these storms, and then a human sacrifice where this woman is captured and she's sacrificed, a heart sacrifice, where both the Chichimecas, the people of the cave, and the people of the city, they're somehow participating in the sacrifice of this woman. The story goes on. I like this particular image because it really represents this idea of a crossroads. They have an argument. And this guy's kind of giving him the finger here and saying, hey, sabes qué? And here's his I call it red hot words. And he's arguing. So these red hot words, and they break up. One group goes this way, and one group goes this way. They have sacred bundles with them, and they open up the sacred bundles. And they come to the city. Now here they are at the city. So you remember the other image of Mexico City in the Codex Mendoza. Now they've arrived at the city, and there is order here. Things are all kind of boxy, and a ritual is taking place, and the ritual has an eagle and a serpent and a butterfly and a grasshopper who they're sacrificing. They're not sacrificing people. But what impressed me about this, that you don't see in the Codex Mendoza, here you see this is the city they go through. This is that scene, that previous scene takes place right here at this location. But this is the city you go through. You see, this is the city you go through. Look how many footprints come in and how many footprints go out. And what they're telling you is that in their view, the city is a very important place, but you go through the city to go somewhere else. This is a much more dynamic view of space and location. And one of my questions for Tony in terms of his work here is, To what extent does archaeoastronomy prepare him to deal with this type of dynamism and change in the cultures that he has studied? So that's my second question. This is an amazing scene in terms of this idea of this dynamism, because take a look, here go the footprints on the journey, and they come to this snowfield. That could be Hamilton today, right? Snowfield. I came in from Boston, it was snowing when we got into Hamilton County. It was like, what is this? Here it is. Maybe it's this. And there's 4 little hillocks. So you have this idea of the 4 quarters. And this tree and this snake, you notice they're twined. This represents the transcendent level of the universe. This is called a malinali. And this guy's hunting this deer. Here's the deer's footprints through the snowfield. He goes, but this snowfield is not on this level of reality. This is the Tamoanchan tree. This is the tree of paradise. And over here he got the deer. And here he's having some dialogue with a woman in a cave. And what we did is the study that Tony and I and others did, we produced this book, which I got to tell you was not a half bad book, called Cave, City, and Eagle's Nest. It's in Spanish and English, but it represents the second mode of being in the world. Not the locative mode, but this crossroads mode. And this crossroads mode has more dynamism, but it has potential. It has potential for change, it has potential for innovation, and I think that's important for students to think about. Okay, finally. So, this Chicano view, the Chicano art. Now, how the Chicanos today, who are in this kind of situation of being pushed out, left out, right now, I mean, you know, for the last couple of months as a Mexican American, I expect every other day to hear something negative about Mexicans. Something made up about Mexicans invading, Mexicans doing this. And so what do you do in a situation like that? There are a lot of things you can do. One of the things you do is you work on imagery that gives depth, meaning, and dignity to the community that you come from. So when I was at the University of Chicago, I was a young scholar, but I was also an activist, and I was involved in this place, in the formation of this place called Casa Aztlán. Casa Aztlán. How many people here have ever heard of Aztlán? Aztlán. So Aztlán really represents this idea of an original Chicano homeland where the Aztecs left in order to go to Mexico City to build the Aztec Empire. So while I'm over here studying with these people, I'm also involved in this life of being in the barrio and being involved and being in dangerous situations and trying to help people find a community center which not only had this imagery outside, but there were all kinds of programs inside, not only for people to learn English, to speak Spanish better, but also to get milk for their children, to find jobs, and so forth at Casa Aztlán. And while I was at the University of Chicago, I studied with this man. His name was Friedrich Katz. And Friedrich Katz was actually a German, an Austrian scholar who had grown up in Mexico, who was very famous because of this book. He wrote the greatest book ever on Pancho Villa. But people didn't know that earlier on he wrote another very important book called The Ancient American Civilizations. And in that book, he really taught me how to think about the long historical tradition that was not only pre-Hispanic, was colonial, but was modern. And that layering really helped me. It helped me realize I didn't have to locate myself just in one area, that there were these historical threads, just as Aveni has shown in his years of doing this kind of work. And it was under his influence that I really went and then wrote my dissertation on Quetzalcoatl and the irony of empire. What happened was I got super lucky, another great story for the students. I got super lucky. I went to Mexico City and I met Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, the great excavator of the great temple. And here he is during the heyday of the excavation of the great temple, started in 1978, when they found this amazing materials underneath the city streets, right there off the Zocalo. I met him and he invited me in and said, "Hey man, I got 2 questions for you." He said, the first question is, he'd heard about me. He said, the first question is, I would like you to help organize with me the first conference on the great Aztec temple excavation. He said, I want you to get involved with Henry Nicholson and other people, and I want to work together with you. He said, secondly, he said, look, help me understand something. I'm a Mexican, and I'm getting phone calls all the time from the United States, from Arizona, from Texas, from California, from these Chicanos, and they think that the excavation of the Great Temple has something to do with them, even though they live in Arizona. He said, I don't get it, I don't understand it. Can you help me understand this? And I said, oh man, I can help you understand this, because I grew up with that. I grew up with that. And that question of his became the basis of this art piece that I'm going to show you in a minute. So what I did is I introduced him to the guy in the middle. His name is Jose Cuellar, also known as Dr. Loco, of Dr. Loco and the Rockin' Jalapeno Band. Because Dr. Loco, his whole musical and anthropological career had been involved with Mexican-American youth called cholos, who were really outsiders, who were dropout pushouts along the border, who were, on the edge of gang life, trying not to be in gang life, and he knew firsthand, in ways that I didn't, about how contemporary Mexicans, Mexican-Americans on the border, especially youth, were looking into their pre-Hispanic past to try to find some type of identity. Now let me tell you a quick story. I don't think Tony knows about this one. So 2 years ago, I got a phone call from a very top legal firm in California. And they said, look, we're representing 8 prisoners in Pelican State Prison. And they have made a claim that their freedom of religion is being blocked by the prison. And they say they're practicing Aztec religion. They want to do prayers in Nahuatl, they want to do sweat bath, they want to do this stuff, and the prison won't let them. And we've taken on their case pro bono. And we want to know if you'll be our man. And I said, how much do you pay? And they said, we pay a lot. And I said, I'm your man. I'm your man even if you don't pay a lot. So I got involved in this case. And these were prisoners who were doing real hard time. These were not nice guys. But they were in the prison, and some of them were artists, and I saw the deposition. They sent me a 75-page deposition. And I had to read through the deposition, and I wasn't sold on the fact that these guys were really doing Aztec religion. Because I've seen a lot of people say they're doing Aztec religion or Native American religion, and maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But as I read through the deposition, I discovered something that I thought was an opening to defend these guys. And it just so happened that one of these guys, the main guy, had grown up on the shores of a place in Mexico called Lake Chapala. And on Lake Chapala, as a little kid, he used to run around with his friends on the edge of the lake, and on low tide, they would find these pieces of pottery and these images of this pottery, and they would go sell it to the tourists. And the grandmother found out, and she said, oh my God, what are you doing? You can't do that. You absolutely cannot do that. She says, look, let me tell you the story. My grandmother learned from her grandmother certain rain rituals that we have been doing in our family secretly for generations. And this pottery is a part of the offerings that we make to Lake Chapala, to the rain god Tlaloc, who lives here in this lake, so it will continue to bring fertility to our families. So when I read this, I thought, wow, this really may be that there's been a transmission that has come down to this prisoner through his family. So I took this part of the deposition and I sent it to Alfredo Lopez Austin in Mexico, who is the leading scholar on the Aztec religion. I said, Alfredo, look what this is. Within 24 hours, he had sent me back 3 early 16th century accounts of rituals, rain-making rituals that were right in line with what this prisoner had told me. So I said, I'm gonna defend this case. So I wrote this long defense of this case. And they presented it to the other side. Oh, I forgot to tell you, a couple days after I accepted this, the government called me up and said, hey man, we're doing this case, will you be our man? I said, I'm on the other side, man. So they had their guy, and their guy wrote a rebuttal of mine. Now, I knew this other guy, and I knew I had him. I had him when I read his account. because he really did not know what he was talking about. So I wrote my response, and I tore him up. I said, look, man, this is really a case. I can make a case for transmission down from the 16th century, because I've got this rituals and this guy's description. And so he said, okay. They said, we're going to court, and we're going to depose you, Professor Crowe. We're going to fly all the way to Boston and depose you, because we're going to court against your guys. I said, fine. Because that means that's $400 an hour for me. Come on over here. I'm ready to do this. I'll contribute some of this to the prisoners. You don't call them prisoners. To the inmates. So we got close to the trial. We got close to the deposition. And they backed down. They backed down. And they won the case. And they got a right now to do this stuff in the prison. So I'm just trying to show you this is not just, kind of symbolic art and so forth. This has an existential meaning to it. And so Dr. Loco and Jose and Eduardo Matos and I, we've been working on this. Here's this whole notion that this is Aztlan up here. This is where the Aztecs come from. They came down here, built the cities, and now these people are the descendants. Historically, that's thin. But symbolically, it's very powerful. I mean, the story of the Continental Congress in this country, there's some very thin things there. All men are created equal. Don't you believe they believed it? So what you begin to see is this artwork. Here's a 16th century codex of feathered serpent. Look at my man's tattoo. This whole question of putting it on the body, on the skin. You wear it on the skin. Give me some skin. Give me some Aztec skin. Look at some of this artwork, Quetzalcoatl in the Barrios. This is very important. This is the feathered serpent as a kind of a water spout in San Diego. Take a look at the feathered serpent here with some of Tony's imagery. There's the sky. There's Saturn. Probably Venus is out there. It looks like some other space junk. But here you see the feathered serpent. This means a lot to these people. Take a look at these tattoos. Here's this tattoo of Quetzalcoatl, but I want to draw your attention, because this is where I'm heading to. This is the eagle warrior who was excavated at the Great Temple. And so people are starting to put on their bodies these types of imagery that represents this connection to this transcultural sense of self. So I turn, what happens is, I persuade Harvard, and I'm coming to the end, to set up for the first time in its 400-year history a lectureship in the name of a Mexican. Can you believe it? Harvard's had 400 years and they've never had a lecture series in the name of a Mexican. As a matter of fact, the Divinity School is 200 years old, and I was the first Spanish surname faculty member in the history of that school. And I can tell you for sure there were a lot of people who knew how to teach religion before I came along. So I persuaded Harvard to do this in the name of Eduardo Matos Moctezuma. And then I said, let's have a Mexican-American paint the emblem of this lecture series. So I knew George Yepes, who had painted this image, which was called La Pistola del Corazon. It was on the cover of one of Los Lobos albums. Madonna purchased the original. He was very interested in Mexican stuff. Some of you know this image of Coatlicue. So Yepes said, I'm going to do something about this, which is going to be very threshold. And he painted this image of the Coatlicue. Only here he has two women, two lesbians in embrace, kissing each other with some of the same imagery as the Coatlicue. It's called Coatlicue in Vienna. And I saw this and I said, man, this is so powerful and so colorful. I'm going to get this guy. I mean, he's got all the layers here. I mean, here's Jesus. Here's Jesus here. It's the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Here are the two women facing each other. Here are the two heads, the two serpents facing one another, and so forth. Someone get this guy, come through for us. And so this was excavated in Mexico City. And I said, George, I want you to paint an image that combines this imagery of the Guerrero Aguila, which is going to become the symbol for the first time in Harvard's history, probably of an indigenous image on the campus, and also a Mexican image. I want you to combine it with Eduardo Matos, in whose name this lecture series has been established, and the discovery of this great Coyolxauhqui stone. Somehow I want you to put this together and do this painting. And this is going to be at Harvard, and it's going to be the thing that we're going to use to inaugurate this lecture series. So George sends me this drawing. He sends me this drawing. Down here it starts out like this. Here's Matos doing the Coyosauqui stone with the eagle warrior. Here's the city. So we got a city here, only now we see this layering. This thing is so sensitive, I'm sorry. And then he sends me this imagery as the painting starts to develop. There's Eduardo Matos, and there's the eagle warrior. And he does this fantastic face, and back there is the Mexican flag. And then this becomes the final painting. And the final painting is 5 feet tall, 4 feet wide. And here's Eduardo Matos. So what you have is the pre-Columbian city, and then you have the Mexican flag. So you have this layering, this transcultural layering. Here's the Mexican flag. And then here is the eagle warrior. And out front is the contemporary time with Eduardo Matos, who is excavating this. This is a transcultural journey through time and place. And my question for Tony is, Tony, when you see this painting, where does your eye fall? What do you see as so outstanding and important? Conversations with Anthony Aveni. Thank you very much for listening. Let's hear what Tony has to say. So let's hear what Tony Aveni has to say. Keep those images
Don't get
up.
nervous, students, because I'm not going to answer all 3 questions. That would take too much time. But David, I have to thank you for your words.
Can you see okay? Should we turn that off?
No, well, no, I'm okay. In fact, I want to keep that last slide up. That is the 5x4.
Yeah.
I will go on and on all day tomorrow telling you how much your being means to me, because whenever we get together, it takes a long time to have a conversation. We don't run around too fast the way we do today. We've got to slow down. So David will be here all day tomorrow, and in fact the conversation is going to resume in the visualization lab, the Hotung Visualization Lab tomorrow at 2 o'clock, where some of these things are going to be demonstrated in the live sky, thanks to Joe Aiken, who directs that facility. And people want to, I'm convinced they can, because when David ran his conversations, as he always does, and still does in the archive, you always have a peanut gallery that sits in the back. And they sit around and they poke questions at the people in the center and periphery. But 3 really interesting questions for us to discuss tomorrow about precision, dynamism, and then finally that contemporary view. And I will only address the first one, tease it a little bit, and make reference to, since I came entirely unprepared in my own PowerPoint, use your last slide to illustrate. I want students to know, I can't say my students, because you're no longer mine, except for Tessa and one other student who might be here.
Let's make sure they can hear you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. But I wanted to tell you that when I first went to Mexico City 48 years ago with Colgate students on our first J term, which was the predecessor of what we now call extended study, I went there looking through my lens as an astronomer. I was trained as an astronomer. And I want the students to know that there was no such thing here as women's studies, Native American studies, peace and conflict studies, biophysics, geophysics. There were no linkages between the disciplines. The disciplines were departments like so many islands in a gulf of mutual incomprehensibility. There was no such thing as interdisciplinarity, if there even is such a word. I believe there is. And so you have to understand the kind of world we operated in. When I came here, longer ago than 48 years, I would not have imagined that we would be intellectual bedfellows. A professor of religion, what has that got to do with hard science? So it was with the eyeball of the precision that the scientist always quests after that I went to visit that building, the Templo Mayor. And the idea for visiting it came to me because I had read a story of a chronicler, a Mexican chronicler, Spanish chronicler, who said that that building, the Templo Mayor, was oriented, where they sacrificed prisoners on the day of a certain festival, was oriented to face the sun on the day of the equinox, but because it was poco tuerto, a little bit twisted out of line, King Moctezuma II had to tear it down and rebuild it. And I thought, well, we have to measure this to see which way it faces. We could segue to another lecture about that, but I have to say my vision was impaired. My vision was out of line. I had the wrong lens on, because it's not just about precision. There's a long story to how precise it is and what it lines up with, but it isn't all about precision, and it wasn't until I started to learn about the people who built that building and the culture in this highly ordered space, like the first page of Codex Mendoza, not like the Mapa de Quantinchan, where there is order, but I'll tell you about the temporal order in that we all know about tomorrow. It was the idea of measuring, and measure this stuff. Now, when I went there in 1970, there was nothing to measure because it hadn't been excavated. We had to wait 12, 13 years for Eduardo to dig it up, and then we went back again, this time with another class. We did that for 39 years of J terms, all with my students, because it was always about them, and still is as far as I'm concerned. But we found that indeed it was tuerto. In fact, it does face the sunrise. They had to twist it out of line to make it fit right. But then I realized that there's a legend, a myth behind that building, and that has to do with the slaying of Quayoxauhqui, who is the moon goddess. You see her, the one with bells on her face, who is dismembered. We only went through that very quickly. Who is being murdered by, of all things, her unborn brother, who emerged from the fetal state right out of the womb, fully armored, right out of Coatlique's womb, and chopped up his sister because he was a little annoyed over the way his mother had become impregnated, sort of like the Aztec version of the Immaculate Conception. She was hit with a bag of hummingbird feathers that fell from above, tucked it in her bosom, and lo and behold became pregnant. And that really pissed off the moon goddess and her 400 brothers, who are the Pleiades. And so I thought, well, there's more astronomy in this. And it's not precise astronomy, but it's in there. And it turns out that when Eduardo excavated that building, he found that right up here is the date of the installation of Huitzilopochtli, who is the god of the sun and war, whom the warriors, after they died, followed for 4 years before they hit the underworld. They followed him. And directly below, on the same axis, is where the stone of Quayoxauhqui was found. And they say that he chased her and dismembered her. Then he chased down the 400 brothers, who were the Pleiades, and slew them. And that's exactly what happens if you look in the sky over the Templo Mayor. You see the sun chasing the moon, killing her every month because she goes through her waning phase and then resumes her crescent phase on the next cycle. And then annually tracking down the 400 brothers, because the Pleiades are located right on the zodiac where the sun moves, and scattering them. They say he scattered them like so many rabbits, which resonates with the rabbit in the face of the moon. Too many things to bring together here. But you begin to get the idea. Well, where do the people come into all this? They are the ones who worship Huitzilopochtli at his temple. And when you worship in the outdoors, you don't need stained glass windows, you don't need corbel arches, because you're outdoors. And so here you have a magnificent display that takes place over the sky above the Templo Mayor, where I can imagine people are prancing and chanting and singing and worshiping their celestial gods. So my mistake about precision, when we did that interview some 35 years ago, was that I didn't have the right prescription for my glasses. I needed a lens in there that had a little bit of the history of religion, and a little bit of anthropology, a little bit of ethnography, which I got from Ed Kalnick and other people. And you were the one who brought it all together at Colorado, and then through Princeton, and then to Harvard, where we're still doing it, and we just don't know when the next one's going to be, probably 2019, which I think is more important than 1492, because that was the first contact with a an empire, a mainland civilization between the old world and the new. So that just touches on one of those questions. So much more in the rest of it. By the way, I think that Eduardo's head could very well be a substitute for the moon. I want to write to him and tell him that it's shining in just the right place, and I like the light. I like the light that the artist put on there. It was wonderful of you to come.
So, anybody got questions they'd like to ask either of us? Especially Professor Aveni. We would be glad to take a moment or two, unless we've answered them all. Yes?
This is not a profound question. When you were showing the pictures, I think it was of the Codex,
Yeah?
the images had written descriptions. What language was that?
So what happens in the Codex is that, first of all, when it was painted in Mexico City in 1542, you have the images, and then on the other pages are Spanish descriptions so that the Spanish king could read them. So what you had was indigenous artists, some who now were bilingual, telling the Spaniards or themselves writing down what was on the pages. So that's why it's such a valuable document.
Valuable, but they screwed up horribly because they totally misinterpreted, misunderstood what was going on. And I think that's the cardinal error, which I learned from my anthropological colleagues, is to even dare to assume that any other culture is going to see space and time in the same way that you do. And of course, being the scientist I was in those days, I would assume that of course they would know about all the concepts of time that we know about. A 260-day cycle, a 52-year cycle, these are not in our repertoire. Who would have imagined that they would have different ways of keeping time, which is what you saw in that second frame with the Mendoza, time wrapping around space. It's Einsteinian, okay? I mean, it's a way you explain how time and space go together, but you don't use equations, very different. These are hard things to imagine, so my education has been to learn all these other disciplines, except I didn't have to pay. I was paid by the university for that. You students have to pay. So, be a professor, I guess.
Yes.
First, thank you for your lecture. I really appreciate the way you connected the three frameworks, and especially the way you bring in Chicano artists and to show this as historical and social connection. But my follow-up questions were about the Mapa de Quantinchan, and one question was just like what happened to it. If it was ever repatriated or given back to museum or anything like that. And second, if you could say a little bit more, either both of you, about the figure of was it Iztapapalot, the obsidian butterfly. Just a little more, just knowing how rare it is for us to see like female images, especially in the codices. Like if you could talk a little more about the significance of that figure, but also just what happened with the mapa.
Sure. So the Mapa de Quantinchan did get conserved and digitally restored, and today it resides in the basement of a museum in Puebla. I've made my best efforts, as well as others, to make it more public so people can see it. We did the book that we did, and we've made some copies of the mapa, which we could give to Colgate. It'd be easy to get the copy to Colgate. It's not an expensive thing. We've taken copies of the mapa back to the community itself, where people reside who are the descendants. But unfortunately, it's still not in the public eye. Now, one of the reasons, justifiably to some extent, is that it needs to be protected. But I believe, and I've written a letter to the family saying, why don't you bring it out for 2 weeks a year? Let the Mexican public come and see it. So we're still hoping that that will happen. But as is the case in so many indigenous objects and creations, once they fall out of the control of the community into these museums, well, they're protected in some ways, that's true, but they also lose access to the community. I mean, it'd be great to have this mapa brought into a situation where some of the contemporary storytellers, some of the people there could come and help us interpret what's on the mappa. We hope that will take place in the future, you know.
I have a copy, which I'd be happy to loan anybody, and I do intend to give to Colgate.
Yeah, and I have we have a number, we could send several copies of the book, Spanish-speaking copies of the book here. If I get I'll just have them sent free of charge for the community here, for the library, for anybody who wants to really study it. Because we made the book so that each page of the mappa is actually in the book, and you can, with a line drawing telling you the actual number of each object. So you asked about her. Yeah, isn't she something? You know, we were studying this at the same time that former Harvard president came out and said some things about women's intelligence. You remember that? Larry Summers came out and said, hey, women can't do math and science. And so he got in a lot of trouble. And I said, I was going to send him this on my Christmas card and say, Larry, this is what happens when you talk that way about women. You know, this is what happens. And so, yeah, no, this is a fabulous image. Very rare, actually, even in the codices, of this larger than male female. She's larger than the males. She's got the color. She's the leader of the action. She's got this incredible name, Obsidian Butterfly, which is both air and something that is very ephemeral, but then there's something from a stone that is sharp and enduring and so important to Mesoamerica, Obsidian Butterfly. So there's this duality. It's interesting that you responded. This is the way many of my students respond when they see this. They want to know about her. They identify with her. And there is a wonderful essay in the book written by Keiko Yoneda, who was the expert on this, about her. And I'm sure that Tony and I can get you access to that.
Okay. Thinking that not unlike the Chicanos, these people are trying to find their identity. I mean, they're getting oriented. They're following the paths and the crossings and fighting the battles that they know someday will result in their finding order in their place. So I think it kind of comes back full circle, don't you think, in a certain way, with the mappa?
Yeah, it comes back full circle, yeah. Yes.
But is she linked to the migration away from the caves, from the seven
Yes.
caves?
Yes.
And is that something that her role has come up in other documents, or is it mostly only in this document?
No, there's other documents as well. And here you see her, you know, in the cave with the others. One of the things that's very important about this is that, take a look here, this is really crucial. See these men, they all have sacred bundles on their back. There's more sacred bundles that show up in this mappa, I think, than any other codex, pre-Hispanic or Conquest, colonial. And these are where the most valuable, precious things of the community were carried. So she's leading them out, they come out, and let me show you. Sorry, hold on. I'm going wrong. Anyway, yeah, she leads them out on this journal. You don't see, I don't know if you see her again. I think you see her in one place. But I think the best thing would be to give you this essay. Maybe you could carry on the scholarship about each papaloto. And in this essay, there's footnotes about where else you can look to find her story.
Thank you.
Who else? What was this students? Yes. Phil.
Tony raised an interesting question. What are the events planned for 2019?
So
That's an interesting
yeah,
thing.
that's a great question, and we're putting together plans right now, which we can talk about over dinner. So there's nothing right now. Yeah. So the big thing now is this Eduardo Matos lecture series. It takes place once in Mexico City in the fall and at Harvard in the spring. This is the first year. So we've had to educate Harvard about it. We had a huge success in Mexico City, and next Tuesday it's going to be in Harvard. Everybody's invited. And as we educate Harvard about this, we're going to think more about what to do in 1519, 1521. My line is this. In 1517, last year, 2017, Martin Luther made this famous statement, "Here I stand," when he nailed these theses to the door of the cathedral, standing against the Catholic Church. People don't realize in the same year, the first Spanish expedition landed on the shores of Mexico, and they said, "Here we land." And the difference between "here I stand" and "here we land" is big, because the whole issue in Mexico became who's the we? Who's included in the we? And what's going to be, how's the land going to be used? And my thing is, these cities are a very important part of the land, but this whole question of the we the people, is who are we? And the Mexicans, for the Mexicans, I give them credit. Indigenous people became part of the we. Mixed race people became part of the we. African, Indian, Spanish, they became part of the we. In this country, they didn't become part of the we until more recently. And so these are very important anniversaries. 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021. And we will be doing stuff together about it, and we're looking forward to it. So maybe Syracuse, Colgate, Harvard, whatever. Anyone else? Anyone else? It's so wonderful to be here with you at this wonderful university, and I want to thank you. Yes?
I was thinking that between the locative map and the crossroad maps, there is also a difference between a city and nature. Like the crossroad map seems to be you outside the city in the mountains with the floods and the earthquakes and all of these natural forces that are outside your control. And the city is the place where humans put things in order to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an excellent idea. You know, these pyramids, when you go to Mexico, you find these pyramids, say in Teotihuacan or in Mexico City. These are pyramids that they built inside of the city, but what they are is they're imitation mountains that they built inside of the city. The pyramids are mountains. And so they got mountains all around, and in the mountains is where the ancestors live, but they build these pyramids partly to allow them to do orientation, but also it's their attempt to get control over nature in the city. And in the Mapa, these people are all out there dealing with it in ways that the city tries to think it's going to control. So, thank you for that observation. Yeah. So, hey, I hope that this has been a good start to what is going to be a wonderful series over the years. And I want to thank the Native American Studies program again for inviting me. And let's have another round of applause for